They called it a classified project, hidden beneath layers of government secrecy and deniability. But its goal was unlike anything the intelligence world had ever dared to attempt. In the early 1970s, as the Cold War tightened its grip, the United States found itself confronting a terrifying possibility that the Soviet Union might be exploring the use of psychic abilities as tools of espionage. The idea sounded absurd until whispers began to surface that Soviet scientists were achieving results that defied logic. It was the era of paranoia and technological competition. Satellites orbited the Earth, missiles stood ready in silos, and codebreakers worked in underground rooms filled with machines. Yet despite all the advances in surveillance, there was still one realm no one could penetrate: the human mind. What if there was a way to gather intelligence, not through cameras or wires, but through consciousness itself? That question reached the desks of high-ranking officials in the CIA and the Department of Defense. Somewhere in the heart of Langley, a small group of scientists, physicists, and military officers began to ask, could the mind, under the right conditions, perceive distant places and hidden objects? Could human awareness somehow travel across space and time without leaving the body? The search for that answer led them to a man named Ingo Swann, an artist, a visionary, and by many accounts a psychic. Swann claimed he could see locations and events without physically being there. He didn't call it magic. He called it perception, pure perception, stripped of the senses. And when he was brought into the laboratory at the Stanford Research Institute in California, something extraordinary happened. Physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ, both respected researchers in laser and quantum physics, were tasked with testing Swann's claims. They were scientists, not mystics. Their job was to determine whether this strange ability could be measured, replicated, and perhaps even trained. And so the first controlled experiments began. Swann was asked to describe hidden objects, sealed inside boxes, or to sketch specific locations miles away. He would close his eyes, take a slow breath, and begin to draw what he saw in his mind. The results unsettled everyone in the room. Time after time, Swann's drawings matched the hidden targets with uncanny accuracy. When asked to describe a building thousands of miles away, he produced sketches that later aligned with aerial photographs. The scientists checked and rechecked their protocols, but no leaks or tricks were found. It was as if Swann's awareness had extended beyond his physical body, reaching something invisible yet real. Word spread quietly through the intelligence community. If such a thing was possible, it could change everything. The CIA, always vigilant for an advantage, funded what became one of the most secretive programs of the Cold War, the Stargate Project. Under this name, teams of trained remote viewers were taught to perceive distant targets using only their minds. The funding was modest at first, almost experimental, but the implications were enormous. The methodology was simple, at least on paper. The viewer was placed in a quiet room, often dimly lit, with minimal distractions. They were given a set of random coordinates, numbers that on their own meant nothing. Their task was to describe the scene connected to those coordinates. It could be a military base in another country, a secret weapon, or even a hostage situation. No maps, no images, no clues, only the mind as the instrument. At first, many in the scientific community mocked the idea. The notion that human consciousness could perceive information beyond the limits of space and time seemed absurd. Yet the data kept coming. Controlled sessions produced sketches and descriptions that repeatedly corresponded to real-world locations. Some were vague, others were shockingly precise. One of the most famous sessions involved Ingo Swann once again. The target was not on Earth, but on Jupiter. Months before NASA's Pioneer 10 spacecraft reached the planet, Swann described details: rings around Jupiter, atmospheric conditions, and unusual magnetic phenomena that were later confirmed by the spacecraft's data. To skeptics, it was coincidence. To the scientists who witnessed it, it was something else, a crack in the walls of perception itself. As the years went on, the program expanded. Military officers, psychologists, and even artists were recruited and trained. They were taught to quiet the analytical mind, to focus on impressions and sensory fragments rather than logic, a smell, a temperature, a sound, a texture. These fragments, when recorded and combined, began to form coherent descriptions of distant targets. It wasn't like seeing with eyes. It was more like remembering something that hadn't happened yet. Some remote viewers claimed to see through walls or deep underground structures. Others claimed to perceive events that had not yet occurred. The scientists remained cautious, documenting everything with precision. Each session was time-stamped, recorded, and sealed. For over time, thousands of pages of data accumulated, data that could not be easily dismissed. And then came the test that would define the program's credibility. The CIA tasked a remote viewer with describing a secret Soviet site known only by its coordinates. The viewer began to sketch massive gantry cranes, circular buildings, and unusual metallic structures. Later, satellite images confirmed the existence of a top-secret facility where the Soviets were constructing a new type of missile. The match was undeniable. For the intelligence community, this was no longer an eccentric experiment. It was potential espionage without risk of capture. Still, the tension between science and belief persisted. For every accurate session, there were many failures. Some results were vague or inconsistent. Critics argued that the successes were due to chance, or to subtle cues unintentionally given by the experimenters. Yet even the harshest skeptics had to admit that something strange was happening, something that challenged the boundaries of known science. Inside the research rooms, the atmosphere was paradoxical. It was part military briefing, part meditation session. Charts of coordinates lay beside sketches of domes and landscapes no one had ever seen. The air buzzed with quiet awe. The participants didn't claim to be supernatural beings. They were ordinary people performing something extraordinary. And that perhaps was the most unsettling part. As the Cold War dragged on, the Stargate Project moved between different agencies. First the CIA, then the Defense Intelligence Agency, and later under the control of the US Army. Its funding fluctuated with the tides of politics. Some administrations saw it as a cheap and promising tool. Others viewed it as pseudoscience draining resources. But throughout the years, the reports kept piling up. Case after case of remote viewing sessions that produced actionable intelligence. Eventually, word began to leak to the public. Journalists caught wind of the rumors. Psychic spies, mind readers working for the government, secret rooms where soldiers learned to see the enemy from across the globe. The story sounded too strange to be true, yet it was, at least in part, real. In 1995, the CIA declassified portions of the program, acknowledging that for over 2 decades, the US government had indeed funded research into psychic phenomena for intelligence purposes. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media. Some laughed. Some were fascinated. Others quietly wondered what it meant for the future of human potential. Could the mind truly reach beyond its biological limits? Or had fear and desperation driven humanity to explore a frontier it wasn't ready to understand? For Ingo Swann and the other remote viewers, the work had never been about espionage. It was about exploring consciousness itself. They believed that human awareness was not confined to the skull, but was part of a vast interconnected field, one that linked every point in space and time. When they viewed a distant target, they weren't sending their minds outward. They were simply tuning into a deeper layer of reality, like tuning a radio to a hidden frequency. Decades later, scientists still debate what really happened inside those rooms. Were the results evidence of an undiscovered capacity of the mind, or the product of coincidence and wishful thinking? The data remains controversial yet persistent. Even today, fragments of those sessions are studied by researchers exploring the nature of consciousness, and maybe that's the real legacy of the Stargate Project. Beyond the secrecy and the skepticism, it forced humanity to confront a possibility we're still reluctant to face. that the mind might not be trapped inside the brain, and that perception may not end at the limits of the body. Perhaps the universe has always been open to us. We just needed the courage to look with our eyes closed. By the early 1980s, the Stargate Project had evolved from a handful of experimental sessions into a structured intelligence unit operating inside the US military. Its existence was still officially denied, buried beneath layers of classified files and obscure funding lines. Yet within that secrecy, something extraordinary was taking shape. A new language of perception, a method that tried to measure the immeasurable. The sessions had become almost ritualistic. Each remote viewer entered a dimly lit room with a simple table, a few sheets of paper, and a recording device. No technology was needed beyond the human mind. They would sit in silence, breathing slowly until their awareness began to stretch beyond the walls. When the monitor, an assigned partner who facilitated the session, spoke the random coordinates aloud, the process began. What followed was a quiet exploration of consciousness itself. Viewers often describe sensations rather than images. A taste of metal, the sound of wind moving through an empty structure, the feeling of heat rising from concrete, small fragments of information that at first seemed meaningless. But when the sketches and notes were analyzed later, the fragments aligned in astonishing ways, forming coherent descriptions of real locations thousands of miles away. Among the most respected viewers was a man named Joseph McMonigle, a retired Army warrant officer who became one of the most consistent performers in the program. McMonigle participated in hundreds of sessions, many of which were later verified through independent sources. He described underground military bunkers, nuclear facilities, and even the location of kidnapped individuals with remarkable precision. His success rate was so high that some CIA analysts quietly began to rely on his sessions as supplemental intelligence. Still, for every documented success, there were failures that fueled skepticism. Remote viewing was unpredictable. Some sessions produced vague impressions that could fit almost any scenario. Others were eerily accurate, but impossible to verify at the time. The human mind, it seemed, was not a machine. It followed rhythms that no one yet understood. The researchers began to wonder whether emotional state, belief, or even subconscious resistance affected the results. Inside the team, a quiet tension grew. Some of the scientists wanted to push the experiments further, to explore not only space but also time. Could remote viewers perceive events from the past or the future? The idea of temporal viewing emerged, and soon the sessions expanded beyond geographical targets. Viewers were asked to describe moments in history, ancient structures, or even future outcomes of world events. The reports were carefully logged, but rarely shared outside the unit. The implications were too explosive. One of the most controversial sessions occurred when a viewer was asked to describe a location designated only by coordinates. The sketches that followed revealed large stone structures, tall pillars, and vast open plains. The data analyst, confused, checked the coordinates again. The target wasn't on Earth, it was Mars. The viewer described humanoid figures, ancient cities, and signs of a civilization long gone. Decades later, when NASA's rovers began sending images from the Martian surface, a few of those sketches resurfaced. Some saw uncanny similarities, others dismissed them as coincidence. But inside the remote viewing community, that session became legendary. Despite the growing body of evidence, the program remained trapped between belief and ridicule. The scientists running it were constantly battling the pressure of credibility. To their military superiors, results mattered more than theories. As long as the information occasionally matched real intelligence, funding continued. But to the researchers themselves, the deeper question persisted. What exactly were they tapping into? Some argued that remote viewing was a latent human ability, a kind of natural radar of consciousness. Others believed it was connected to quantum entanglement, the mysterious phenomenon in which particles remain linked across distance and time. A few saw it through the lens of spirituality, the idea that all minds are part of a single universal awareness. None of these explanations could be proven, yet none could be disproven either. The data hovered in a gray zone between science and mystery. For the remote viewers, the work took an emotional toll. Spending hours in altered states of perception blurred the boundaries between imagination and reality. Some described dreams that seemed to continue their sessions, or sudden flashes of distant places appearing without warning. The mind, once stretched beyond its limits, seemed reluctant to return to normal. A few participants quietly withdrew, unable to reconcile what they had seen with their understanding of the world. McMoneagle, however, persisted. He treated remote viewing not as a psychic gift, but as a discipline, one that required structure, patience, and respect. He believed the process worked best when stripped of ego, when the viewer acted as a neutral observer rather than a seeker of proof. His calm, methodical approach gave the program a sense of legitimacy it desperately needed. Even skeptics within the intelligence community began to acknowledge that something was happening, even if they couldn't explain it. Outside the program, the scientific world remained skeptical. Experiments in parapsychology had long struggled with replication. The same problem plagued remote viewing. Results could not be reliably repeated in laboratory conditions, at least not with the precision required for mainstream science. For many researchers, that was enough to dismiss the entire field. But for those inside the Stargate Project, the question was no longer whether it worked. It was why it sometimes did. As the program expanded, it began to attract attention from unlikely allies. Physicists studying quantum mechanics, psychologists exploring altered states, and even philosophers interested in consciousness began to take notice. They saw in remote viewing a clue, a doorway to understanding how perception might extend beyond the brain. If human awareness could access information non-locally without sensory input, then perhaps consciousness was not a byproduct of biology, but a fundamental aspect of the universe itself. The Cold War continued to fuel funding. Every rumor of Soviet psychic research reignited urgency. Reports from Eastern Europe suggested that the KGB had its own equivalent programs, training individuals to influence or spy on targets from afar. Whether those claims were true or not, they kept the American program alive. The race for psychic superiority mirrored the arms race, but this battlefield was invisible, fought in the quiet spaces of the human mind. Over the years, thousands of sessions accumulated in the archives. Targets ranged from secret military installations to lost aircraft and foreign laboratories. Some sessions produced information that later proved accurate, though often too late to be useful. Others offered insights that traditional intelligence methods couldn't obtain. A few even led to breakthroughs, guiding search efforts or confirming satellite data. But the most intriguing results were always the ones that defied explanation. The glimpses into places or events that couldn't possibly have been known by any conventional means. Eventually, questions began to surface at higher levels of government. Was this research truly valuable, or was it an expensive curiosity driven by Cold War paranoia? Some officials saw it as a psychological experiment disguised as intelligence work. Others feared it touched something beyond human understanding. Funding wavered, reviews were ordered, and the program's fate became uncertain. Inside the project, the researchers continued their work with quiet conviction. Many no longer cared whether the rest of the world believed them. They had seen enough to know that perception was more complex than anyone had imagined. For them, the walls between observer and observed were starting to dissolve. They began to see the universe not as a collection of separate objects, but as a web of interconnected awareness, each thought, each perception, influencing the whole. It was during this period that some participants reported strange synchronicities in their lives. Coincidences multiplied, Thought seemed to manifest as external events. The line between experiment and experience blurred. Some began to wonder if remote viewing wasn't just about seeing distant places, but about reshaping the way consciousness interacts with reality itself. The scientists documented everything, though they couldn't explain it. Their notebooks became filled with not only sketches and coordinates, but reflections on existence, perception, and the nature of time. They were no longer just collecting data, they were mapping the edges of human potential. By the late 1980s, cracks began to form in the project's foundation. Political interest shifted, budgets tightened, and skepticism grew louder. The Cold War was winding down, and with it the justification for programs that operated in the shadows. The Stargate Project was quietly reduced, then absorbed, then forgotten, at least officially. But within those walls, something irreversible had already happened. The researchers and viewers who had witnessed the impossible could never see reality in the same way again. And perhaps that was the true experiment all along. Not to gather intelligence, not to spy on distant targets, but to confront the boundaries of what it means to perceive. Because once the mind learns it can reach beyond space, it can never again believe it is small. When the Cold War finally began to fade, the Stargate Project stood at a crossroads. The geopolitical tension that had once justified its existence was dissolving. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union was collapsing. And inside the halls of the US intelligence community, a quiet question echoed, what do we do with a project born from fear, now that the fear is gone? For over 2 decades, the files had grown thicker. Thousands of reports, drawings, and transcripts from remote viewing sessions. Some of them had led to tangible results. Others had wandered into the abstract. To the analysts responsible for reviewing the data, it was an impossible paradox. Information too strange to ignore, yet too unorthodox to present as evidence. As one CIA officer later said, it worked until you tried to prove that it worked. In the early 1990s, the program came under scrutiny. The American Institutes for Research was commissioned to evaluate its effectiveness. The scientists approached the task with skepticism, but also curiosity. They reviewed the archives, interviewed participants, and tried to apply modern statistical methods to phenomena that defied measurement. Their final report was cautious. While acknowledging that some results were statistically significant, they concluded there was not enough reliable evidence to justify continued funding. The official story ended there. The program was shut down in 1995, but the truth, as always, was more complex. The declassified documents revealed only fragments of what had actually happened. Many reports were redacted, entire sessions missing. What remained painted a picture of both brilliance and chaos, of disciplined experimentation and unexplainable insight. The government quietly closed the books, but the people who had participated could not simply return to ordinary life. Once you have seen the world through the eyes of remote viewing, reality itself never feels quite the same. Joseph McMonigal, still devoted to the work, continued to train civilians and researchers. Ingo Swann retreated from the spotlight, publishing writings that blended science, philosophy, and art. Russell Targ began lecturing around the world, arguing that consciousness is a non-local phenomenon, a field rather than a point. Each of them carried the same conviction, that what they had touched inside those rooms was real, even if the rest of the world wasn't ready to accept it. Public curiosity grew. Books were written, documentaries produced, and television specials aired, each promising to unveil the government's psychic spies. Some exaggerated the truth, others barely scratched the surface, yet behind the sensationalism lay a quiet revolution. The idea that human perception might be far more expansive than anyone had dared to believe. Skeptics countered that the data could be explained by coincidence, suggestion, or the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. Scientists demanded replication under strict controls, and most experiments failed to meet their standards. But the question refused to die. Decade after decade, new generations of researchers kept returning to the mystery. What if the failure was not in the phenomenon, but in our understanding of how consciousness itself operates? As neuroscience advanced, some theories began to echo the language once used in the Stargate files. Quantum physics hinted that observation might shape reality at a fundamental level. Experiments in entanglement suggested that information could be linked across distance without any known physical connection. To those who had once sat in those quiet rooms, it all sounded strangely familiar. Outside the scientific world, ordinary people began experimenting on their own. Meditation groups, universities, and even online communities started testing remote viewing protocols. Some followed the original coordinate-based method. Others used photographs or hidden targets. Results varied widely. Some were clear, some vague, but enough were compelling to keep the movement alive. Remote viewing had escaped the laboratory. It had become part of the cultural landscape. For many participants, the process was less about spying and more about self-discovery. They described moments of deep stillness, where the boundaries between subject and object dissolved. In that silence, they felt connected to something vast and intelligent, something that seemed to exist both within and beyond them. The act of seeing became a mirror reflecting the mind's own depth. One former viewer described it simply, "When I look out there, I realize there is no out there." The statement echoed a truth found in both science and spirituality, that the universe may not be a collection of separate things, but a single unfolding awareness observing itself through countless forms. Still, the mystery remained unsolved. If remote viewing worked even occasionally, how did it work? Was it a hidden sense like sight and hearing? Was it a byproduct of quantum connection, or an emergent property of consciousness that science had yet to define? The answer perhaps lies somewhere between physics and philosophy, between the measurable and the meaningful. Over time, the declassified files took on a strange life of their own. Students of psychology studied them for insights into altered states. Historians analyzed them as relics of Cold War experimentation. Mystics read them as proof of the soul's reach beyond the body. And through all these interpretations, one constant thread remained: the human desire to know, to see, to understand what lies beyond the visible. In a world still dominated by data and technology, the idea of remote viewing feels almost archaic, like a forgotten dream from another age. Yet its core question continues to haunt us. What if consciousness is not confined to the skull? What if the mind itself is the true frontier? Perhaps that's why, even after the official closure, whispers of ongoing research persist. Independent labs in Europe and Asia quietly test similar phenomena. Former military personnel still share stories of classified sessions that remain unacknowledged. And every so often a document surfaces, redacted, partial, but unmistakable in its implication that the exploration never truly ended. For the few who were there, the lesson was not about psychic power or secret knowledge. It was about humility. They learned that the universe doesn't yield its mysteries through force, but through attention. The act of observing with sincerity seemed to open doors that logic alone could not. In that sense, remote viewing was never just a tool of espionage. It was an experiment in human potential. When asked years later whether he believed remote viewing would ever be fully accepted, Russell Targ smiled and said, "It doesn't matter. Reality doesn't need belief to exist." His words carried the quiet conviction of someone who had seen too much to doubt. Today, fragments of the Stargate legacy live on in scientific conferences, meditation retreats, and classrooms that explore the nature of awareness. The idea is no longer confined to intelligence agencies. It belongs to anyone willing to test the boundaries of their own perception. And maybe that's where the true experiment continues, not in hidden facilities or secret files, but in the mind of every human being who dares to close their eyes and look beyond what is seen. Because in the end, The greatest frontier is not space nor time, nor the mysteries of the universe. It is the quiet realization that consciousness itself may be the field through which everything is known,